Hello and welcome to What the F*** Just Happened Today, your essential guide to the daily shock and awe in national politics. I'm Joe Amditis, let's get to it. It's Monday, March 7th, 2022. Welcome to day 412. A bipartisan group of lawmakers reached a deal to ban the import of Russian energy and to suspend normal trade relations with Russia, and Belarus in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The bill also provides Biden with the authority to increase tariffs on both countries and would require the U.S. Trade Representative to seek the suspension of Russia's participation in the WTO, as well as try to halt Belarus's attempt to join the Global Trade Organization. It's unclear, however, if Biden will sign the legislation if it eventually reaches his desk. Over the weekend, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that he would support a ban on Russian oil imports. The prospect of Russian energy sanctions sent oil prices to a 14-year high, with the average national gas price exceeding $4 a gallon. Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, told a group of Aeroflot flight attendants that Western sanctions on Russia were akin to a declaration of war. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has discussed a possible deal to send Poland's Soviet-era MiG fighter jets to Ukraine. In exchange, the U.S. would replace Poland's planes with American-made F-16s. Ukraine's government is interested in the old planes because the country's military pilots already know how to fly them. Putin, however, warned that Moscow would view any Western attempts to impose no-fly zones over Ukraine as participating in the armed conflict against Russia. Separately, nearly all of the troops Russia amassed on Ukraine's border are now fighting inside the country, and the U.S. says it doesn't believe that Russia is preparing to move additional battalion tactical groups from elsewhere in the country to shore up what they've put into Ukraine. Instead, Moscow is reportedly recruiting Syrians who are skilled in urban combat to help fight in Ukraine. Back in the U.S., after Trump described Putin as smart, savvy, and a genius, Mike Pence said there was no room in the Republican Party for, quote, apologists for Putin, end quote. Trump, while insisting that the attack on Ukraine never would have happened on his watch, told the Conservative Political Action Conference last week that the, quote, problem is not that Putin is smart, which of course he is smart, but the real problem is that our leaders are dumb, so dumb, end quote. Former Attorney General William Barr, meanwhile, suggested that he would vote for Trump in 2024, despite believing that Trump was, quote, responsible in the broad sense of that word, end quote, for the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Quote, I think the whole idea was to intimidate Congress, and I think that that was wrong, end quote. Barr added that he has not seen evidence that Trump, quote, was legally responsible for it in terms of incitement, end quote. Trump, in the meantime, has continued to repeat his false claims of election fraud and says that Barr, quote, wouldn't know voter fraud if it was staring him in the face, and it was. The fact is he was weak, ineffective, and totally scared of being impeached, which the Democrats were constantly threatening to do, end quote. Meanwhile, the National Archives delivered Trump's White House visitor logs to the January 6th committee. Trump has tried to block the release of the logs, but Biden rejected his claim that they were subject to executive privilege, quote, in light of the urgency, end quote, of the committee's work and of Congress's compelling need. The archives also turned over Mike Pence's records. Moving on, researchers have identified COVID-associated brain shrinkage equivalent to as much as a decade of normal aging, according to a study published in Nature. The study used before and after brain images of 785 British people and found that even a mild case of COVID-19 may cause greater loss of gray matter and tissue damage in the brain than normally occurs in people who have not been infected with the virus. The death toll from COVID-19, meanwhile, eclipsed 6 million people. Meanwhile, in Florida, the Surgeon General recommended against vaccinating healthy children for COVID-19, despite the recommendation from the CDC that everyone ages 5 and up get vaccinated. Florida is going to be, quote, the first state to officially recommend against the COVID-19 vaccines for healthy children, said Joseph Ladapo, without elaborating on the details or his rationale. Ladapo, who leads Florida's Department of Health, made the announcement at the end of a roundtable discussion that Governor Ron DeSantis convened to discuss, quote, ending COVID theater once and for all, end quote. In response, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said, quote, it's deeply disturbing that there are politicians peddling conspiracy theories out there and casting doubt on vaccination when it is our best tool against the virus and the best tool to prevent even teenagers from being hospitalized, end quote. The CDC also recommends that parents get their children vaccinated, saying, quote, COVID-19 can make children very sick and cause children to be hospitalized. In some situations, the complications from infection can lead to death." End quote. And finally, the Amazon rainforest is nearing its tipping point, as more than half of the rainforest could be irreversibly turned into a savanna. This according to a study published in the journal Nature Climate Change. Satellite images taken over the past several decades show that more than 75% of the rainforest is getting drier, and it's taking longer to regenerate after disturbances, such as droughts and wildfires. Losing the rainforest could result in up to 90 billion tons of carbon dioxide getting put back into the atmosphere, the equivalent of several years of global emissions. And researchers fear that this carbon release would put the world's goal of limiting temperature rise to just 1.5 degrees Celsius well out of reach. And in the polls, Quinnipiac says 71% of Americans say they'd support a ban on Russian oil even if it meant higher gas prices in the U.S., including 82% of Democrats, 70% of independents, and 66% of Republicans. That's all for now. You can find the links and sources for all of these stories on the main website. And as always, visit whatthefjusthappenedtoday.com for the latest news and headlines. Until next time, I'm Joe Amditas.